I am 30 years old, yet my father just ordered me to my room like a child. My crime was warning him that the $19 billion merger was a death sentence. He thinks locking the door strips me of power. But he is wrong, hidden on a server in this very room. I have an AI capable of dismantling his entire empire, and I am about to set it loose. My name is Trinity Anderson, and in the high-altitude air of the American elite, names carry weight. My last name alone is worth billions. It opens doors before I even reach for the handle. It silences waiters and makes senators nervous. But within the walls of my father's house, that name is nothing more than a tag on a piece of inventory. I am 30 years old. I have a dual degree in economics and data science from Stanford. I sit on the boards of 3 charities and manage a personal portfolio that outperforms the market by 12% annually. Yet, to Robert Anderson, the titan behind Anderson Global Holdings, I am merely the decorative features of his empire. I am the face they put on the glossy brochures when they need to soften the company's predatory image. I am the one who cuts the ribbons, smiles for the cameras, and stands silently to the left while the men talk about the future. For the last 6 months, the future had a price tag, $19 billion. That was the valuation of the merger my father was obsessively pursuing. It was the capstone of his career, the deal that would cement his legacy as not just a billionaire, but a historical figure in American finance. He wanted to acquire Logic Systems, a massive data infrastructure firm that promised to modernize our entire logistics network. On paper, it looked like the deal of the century. The press called it visionary. Wall Street was salivating. My brother, Lucas, the golden boy and heir apparent, was practically preening on every financial news segment, talking about synergy and paradigm shifts. But I knew something they did not. I knew because I did not trust the curated reports that landed on the mahogany table in the boardroom. I did not trust the due diligence team that was more interested in keeping their retainers than finding problems. So, I used the one thing my father never thought I was capable of understanding: technology. 3 years ago, I funded a private, off-the-books project with a team of developers I met in Palo Alto. We built Nox. It was not just an algorithm. It was an aggregator, a digital bloodhound designed to sniff out inconsistencies across millions of data points that standard audits missed. While my father and Lucas were toasting to their own brilliance with 40-year-old scotch, I was sitting in my apartment at 3 o'clock in the morning, watching Nox tear through the target company's financials. The screen had turned red 2 nights ago. Nox had found a pattern. A series of shell companies in the supply chain were invoicing for services that never happened. The revenue streams were circular. The target company was pumping its own cash through 3 offshore entities to inflate its earnings by nearly 40%. The $19 billion valuation was built on a foundation of smoke. If Anderson Global Holdings signed that contract, we would be absorbing billions in toxic debt and fraudulent assets. It would not just hurt the stock price, it would trigger a cascade of SEC investigations that could shatter the empire my grandfather built. I sat in my car outside my father's estate in Connecticut, clutching a simple leather folder. My hands were shaking, not from fear, but from the adrenaline of the truth. I had the proof. I had the bank routing numbers, the timestamps, the digital fingerprints of the fraud. I told myself that this time would be different. This time, I was not the little girl asking for attention. I was the savior of the company. I walked into the house. The air inside was always 10 degrees cooler than the world outside, filtered and scented with cedar and old money. The butler nodded to me, his face impassive. "They are in the West Study, Miss Trinity," he said. I navigated the hallway, the heels of my shoes clicking a sharp rhythm against the marble. I pushed open the double oak doors without knocking. The West Study was my father's sanctuary. It was a room of dark wood, green leather, and the heavy scent of cigars. Robert Anderson sat behind his desk, a massive slab of walnut that looked like a fortress. Lucas was leaning against the mantelpiece, swirling a glass of amber liquid, looking every bit the poster child for American aristocracy. They stopped talking when I entered. Trinity, my father said. His voice was a low rumble, devoid of warmth. He did not look up from the documents he was signing. We are in the middle of a strategy session. The gala is in 2 days. Go see your mother about the seating arrangements. The dismissal was automatic. It stung, as it always did, but I pushed through it. I'm not here about the gala. Dad, I said. Stepping further into the room, I placed the leather folder directly on top of the papers he was reading. I am here about the merger. Lucas chuckled, a dry, patronizing sound. Oh, this should be good. Did you find a typo in the press release? Trin? We have people for that. I ignored him. I kept my eyes on my father. You need to stop the deal. Dad, the numbers are fake. Robert finally looked up. His eyes were the color of steel, cold and unyielding. He looked at me with a mixture of annoyance and boredom. What are you babbling about? I ran an independent audit, I said, my voice steadying. Not through the firm, through my own channels. The target company is inflating their revenue. 40% of their reported earnings for the last 4 quarters came from shell entities they control. It is a wash trade scheme. If you sign for $19 billion on Friday, you are buying a corpse. I tapped the folder. It is all in there. The routing numbers, the fake invoices, the names of the directors who sit on both sides of the transaction. For a second, there was silence. I thought, just for a fleeting heartbeat, that I had reached him. I thought the gravity of the accusation would force him to look, to act like a CEO instead of a king. Then, Lucas laughed. It was not a nervous laugh. It was a genuine, amused guffaw. An independent audit? Lucas asked, walking over to the desk. He picked up my folder, not to read it, but to weigh it in his hand mockingly. You mean you played detective on your laptop? Dad? She probably found some conspiracy theory on a blog. It is not a theory, Lucas, I snapped, my patience fraying. It is raw data. Look at it. I do not have time for your games. Trinity, my father said, his voice dropping an octave. We have 50 lawyers and 3 accounting firms vetting this deal. You think you, with your little hobby projects, found something they missed? They missed it because they were looking at what the company wanted them to see, I argued, leaning over the desk. I looked at what they tried to hide. Dad, please, just read the first 3 pages. If I am wrong, I will never say another word about the business again. But if I am right, I just saved you $19 billion and a federal indictment. Robert stared at me. The muscles in his jaw tightened. He stood up slowly, his height imposing. He reached out and took the folder from Lucas's hand. My heart hammered against my ribs. He is going to look. He is going to see. Robert Anderson held the folder with 2 hands, and then, with a slow, deliberate motion, he tore it in half. The sound of the thick paper ripping was like a gunshot in the quiet room. He threw the pieces onto the floor, scattering the evidence of a billion-dollar fraud like trash. You are delusional, he said, his voice quiet and terrifying. And you are insolent. I stood frozen, staring at the torn pages. Dad. Do not call me that, he snarled, suddenly shouting, his face flushing red. I am the CEO of this company. You are a mascot. You do not think. You do not analyze. You smile and you wave. How dare you walk into my office and question my judgment? How dare you insult my team, my son, and my legacy with your paranoid fantasies? I am trying to protect you, I yelled back, the professional mask finally cracking. You are trying to get attention, Lucas interjected, stepping closer to father, presenting a united front. She is jealous. Dad, she knows this deal makes me the undisputed successor, and she cannot handle it. I do not care about the succession, I cried, tears of frustration stinging my eyes. I care that you are walking into a trap. Enough! Robert slammed his hand on the desk. The crystal decanter on the corner rattled. I have heard enough. I will not have you poisoning the water 2 days before the signing. I will not have you whispering this insanity to the board members or the press. He walked around the desk and stood inches from me. I could smell the stale tobacco on his breath. "You are grounded," he said. I blinked. Sure, I had misheard. "What?" "You heard me," he said. "You are going back to the city. You are going to your penthouse. And you are going to stay there until you learn your place. I am taking your security clearance. I am taking your cards. I am having security stand outside your door. You do not leave. You do not call anyone. You do not post on social media. You sit there and you think about the disrespect you have shown me today." "I am 30 years old," I whispered, the absurdity of it choking me. "You cannot ground me." "I bought that penthouse," Robert hissed. "I pay the maintenance fees. I pay for the clothes on your back and the car you drove here in. As long as you live on my money, you live by my rules. If you step 1 foot out of that apartment before I tell you that you can, I will cut you off. Completely. No trust fund, no access, no name. You will be on the street." He turned his back on me. "Lucas, call security," he said, dismissing me as if I were a servant who had broken a plate. "Escort her back to the city. Confiscate her electronics. I want her offline." Lucas pulled his phone out, a smirk playing on his lips that he didn't bother to hide. "Sure thing, Dad." I looked at the torn papers on the floor. The charts showing the circular revenue flow were ripped down the middle. The truth was lying there, garbage at his feet. I realized then that this was not about the money. It was not about the deal. It was about control. He would rather lose $19 billion than admit his daughter was right and he was wrong. He would rather drive the company into a mountain than let me take the wheel for even a second. 2 large men from the private security detail appeared in the doorway a moment later. They looked uncomfortable, but they followed orders. "Miss Anderson," one of them said, "please." I straightened my spine. I wiped the single tear that had escaped down my cheek. I looked at Lucas, who was watching me with the satisfaction of a predator who had just seen the competition eliminated. Then I looked at the back of my father's head. "You are making a mistake," I said quietly. He did not answer. I turned and walked out of the study, flanked by the guards. I was being marched out of my childhood home like a criminal. They drove me back to the city in silence. When we reached my building, they rode the elevator up with me. They waited while I unlocked the door. "We will need your phone and your laptop, Miss Anderson," the guard said, holding out a plastic bin. "And the smartwatch." I handed them over. I gave them everything they asked for. I let them strip me of my communication, my connection to the outside world, my ability to scream for help. They closed the heavy door of the penthouse. I heard the distinct click of the lock. I was a prisoner in a glass cage floating 60 stories above Manhattan. The city lights were twinkling below, indifferent to my rage. My father thought he had won. He thought he had silenced me. He thought that by taking my phone and locking the door, he had cut me off from the power to stop him. He forgot one thing. I walked into the library of my apartment. It was a sleek, modern room, nothing like my father's stuffy study. I went to the bookshelf and pulled out an old, dusty e-reader that I had not turned on in years. It looked like junk. It looked like something a billionaire's daughter would throw away. But inside the plastic casing, the hardware had been stripped and replaced. It was not an e-reader anymore. It was a terminal. I sat down in the dark, the only light coming from the city outside. I pressed the power button. The screen flickered to life, not with a book menu, but with a command line interface. "Welcome. Trinity." The text read in green pixels. "System Knox is active." My father had grounded me. He had humiliated me. He was about to sign away the empire. "Okay, Knox," I whispered to the empty room. "Let's burn it down." Silence has a sound. In a penthouse suspended 600 feet above the streets of Manhattan, silence sounds like the low, electric hum of a refrigerator that costs more than a luxury sedan. It sounds like the wind pressing against 3 inches of reinforced glass. It sounds like the utter absence of notifications. For the first time in 15 years, my digital life had flatlined. My phone, my tablet, my primary laptop, all gone. The security team had even swept the apartment for smart devices, disconnecting the voice assistants and the internet-enabled thermostat. They left me with a landline that could only dial internal numbers at the main estate and emergency services. It was not just grounding, it was an erasure. My father had not just sent me to my room, he had unplugged me from the sentry. I spent the first hour pacing. The apartment, a space I had curated with minimalist precision, suddenly felt like a mausoleum. The beige Italian leather sofas looked like they were waiting for guests who would never arrive. The abstract art on the walls, sharp angles and bleeding colors, felt like it was mocking my confinement. I walked from the master bedroom to the kitchen and back again, measuring my cage in footsteps. 40 paces north, 30 paces west. This was the scope of my existence. Around noon, the elevator chimed. It was the only entrance, and it required a keycard that had been deactivated for me. The doors slid open, and my mother, Diane, stepped out. She did not look like a woman whose husband had just placed their adult daughter under house arrest. She looked like she was arriving for tea. Her hair was perfectly coiffed, her pearls caught the light, and she was carrying a Tupperware container of homemade lasagna, an absurd domestic prop in the middle of a corporate war zone. "Trinity," she said, her voice soft, floating on a cloud of denial. "I brought you something to eat. I know you hate the cook's pasta sauce." She set the container on the marble island and looked around the apartment. Avoiding my eyes, she was checking for damage, for signs of hysteria. "Mom," I said, leaning against the counter, crossing my arms. "There is a security guard named Ralph, sitting on a folding chair outside my front door. He has a gun." "He is there for your protection," she said quickly, a rehearsed line. She finally looked at me, her eyes pleading. "Your father he is under a lot of pressure. Trinity, the merger is the biggest thing he has ever done. You know how he gets when he is focused." "I am 30 years old," I reminded her, my voice flat. "This is kidnapping." "It is a cooling-off period," she corrected, reaching out to smooth a wrinkle on my sleeve that didn't exist. Just apologize. Honey, please, write him a letter. Tell him you were stressed, that you didn't mean to question his authority. He just wants to feel respected. If you do that, he will let you out in time for the gala." I looked at her, really looked at her, and saw the tragedy of her life. She had spent 40 years managing Robert Anderson's ego, smoothing over his rages, redefining his abuse as pressure or passion. She wanted me to do the same. She wanted me to bend the knee so the family portrait would remain unblemished. "I cannot apologize for the truth. Mom," I said, "the deal is rotten. He is going to ruin us." Diane's face hardened, the softness evaporated, replaced by the steeliness of a woman who chose her side long ago. "The deal is happening. Trinity, whether you like it or not. The only question is whether you want to be part of this family when the ink dries. Stop being so stubborn. It is unbecoming." She left 10 minutes later. She didn't hug me. She just left the lasagna and the heavy scent of her Chanel perfume, a lingering reminder of the world I was cut off from. I did not eat the lasagna. I sat on the floor of the library, staring at the spine of a first-edition novel, waiting for the next act. I knew it was coming. My father used the stick. My mother used the guilt. Now they would send the victor to survey the spoils. Lucas arrived at 6 in the evening. He didn't bring food. He brought a bottle of champagne and 2 glasses. He looked crisp in a suit that cost $5,000. His tie loosened just enough to suggest he had finished a hard day of being a titan of industry. "Cozy," he said, looking around the darkening apartment. I hadn't turned on the lights. "A bit gloomy, though. Did Dad cut the electricity too? Or are you just brooding?" I was sitting on the sofa, knees pulled up to my chest. I had decided on my strategy hours ago. If I fought him, he would keep his guard up. If I argued facts, he would shut me down. So, I gave him what he wanted. I gave him the defeated little sister. I looked up, letting my shoulders slump. I made sure my eyes looked red, rubbing them just before he walked in. "What do you want, Lucas?" I asked, my voice cracking perfectly. "Just checking on the prisoner," he said, pouring champagne into both glasses. He held one out to me, I didn't take it. He shrugged and drank it himself. You really stepped in it this time. Barging into the office, screaming about fraud. You sounded like a lunatic. I was worried, I stammered, looking down at my hands. I saw some numbers, and I panicked. I didn't mean to embarrass him. Lucas sat down on the coffee table, facing me. He leaned in, invading my personal space, radiating smugness. You didn't just embarrass him, you insulted him. You questioned the legacy. Dad was talking about cutting you out of the trust entirely. I had to talk him down. I told him you were just emotional, that you've been working too hard on your little charity projects and lost perspective. He was lying, of course. He would have been the one handing our father the scissors to cut the trust fund strings. But I nodded, sniffing loudly. Thank you, I whispered. I don't know what happened. I just feel so stupid. Lucas smiled. It was a shark's smile, all teeth and no warmth. He reached out and patted my knee. Look, leave the heavy lifting to the big boys, okay? You are smart. Trin, in your own way, but you don't have the stomach for high finance. You see a shadow and think it is a monster. We see the big picture. This $19 billion, it is going to make us kings. Just sit tight. Wait for Dad to cool off. And maybe in a month or two, we can find you a nice, safe position in the foundation. Something with less numbers. He stood up, finishing his drink. He felt big. He felt victorious. He had seen me broken, and that fed his ego better than any closing bell. Enjoy the quiet, he said, walking to the elevator. I have a board dinner to get to. We are celebrating the pre-signing. The elevator doors closed, sealing him out. The moment the numbers above the door hit the ground floor, I stood up. The slump in my shoulders vanished. The tears dried instantly. I walked to the kitchen, poured the champagne he had left down the sink, and washed the glass. They thought I was grounded. They thought I was a child in a timeout. They had no idea that they had just locked me in a room with a weapon. I went back to the library and retrieved the e-reader. The battery was at 89%. I sat in the corner of the room, away from the windows where a drone or a telephoto lens might catch the glow of the screen. Knox, I murmured. Resume session. The black and white e-ink screen refreshed. The command line was waiting. The device was slow, the refresh rate agonizing compared to my confiscated workstation, but the connection was secure. It was tunneling through a dummy server in Iceland, completely invisible to the Anderson Global IT department. Query, I typed. Lucas Anderson, personal holdings, cross-reference with offshore accounts flagged in the Panama database. Knox churned. The cursor blinked. 1 second, 2 seconds. Text began to populate the screen. My brother was not just arrogant, he was sloppy. He had been moving money for months, hiding it behind a labyrinth of LLCs registered in the Cayman Islands and Delaware. But Knox didn't care about LLC names. Knox followed the metadata of the transfers. I saw the pattern immediately, and my blood ran cold. Lucas was not buying stock in Anderson Global. He wasn't even holding his current position. He was shorting it. He had leveraged nearly everything he had, his personal liquid assets, loans against his future inheritance, even money he had quietly siphoned from the family foundation, to place massive put options on our own company stock. I stared at the numbers. Put options with a strike price of $40. Our stock was currently trading at 112s. For Lucas to make money, the stock had to crash. It had to plummet. He needed Anderson Global to lose more than 60% of its value. He knew. The realization hit me harder than my father's shouting. Lucas knew the merger was toxic. He knew the $19 billion deal was a poison pill. He had seen the same data I had, or at least enough of it to know the ship was going to sink. But instead of steering us away from the iceberg, he was betting on the shipwreck. He was pushing our father to sign the deal, pumping up the hype, and driving the stock price up so he could short it at the peak. When the fraud was inevitably revealed, when the SEC raided the offices and the stock collapsed, Lucas would make hundreds of millions of dollars while the family empire burned to ash. He wasn't the heir apparent, he was the arsonist. I scrolled further. The dates lined up perfectly. Every time he went on television to praise the deal, he bought more puts through a shell company called Vanguard Horizon. He was manipulating the market, driving the price up to maximize his profit on the way down. I set the e-reader down on the floor. The penthouse was silent, but now the silence felt different. It wasn't empty anymore. It was heavy with the weight of treason. My mother wanted to keep the family intact. She wanted me to apologize to keep the peace, but there was no peace to keep. The war had already started, and the enemy was sitting at the dinner table, pouring wine for my father. I stood up and walked to the floor-to-ceiling window. The city sprawled out below me, a grid of electricity and ambition. Somewhere down there, Lucas was at a board dinner, shaking hands, smiling, playing the role of the dutiful son while holding a knife behind his back. I had spent my whole life trying to earn my father's respect. I had spent my whole life trying to protect the name Anderson. I had tried to save them from the fraud, and they had locked me up for it. A cold, hard clarity settled over me. It was sharper than grief, stronger than anger. If I exposed the fraud now, legally, I might save the company, but Lucas would likely find a way to spin it, to claim ignorance, to survive. He would still be the heir. He would still be the golden boy, and I would still be the daughter who caused trouble. But if I let them sign? If I let the deal go through, the toxic assets would flood the system. The stock would tank. Lucas would cash out his billions. But Knox had another capability, a capability I had never tested. I looked back at the e-reader. Lucas was betting on a crash. He was betting on chaos. But he was betting on controlled chaos. He needed the crash to happen on his timeline, in a way that let him exit his positions quietly. What if the crash was total? What if the revelation didn't just hurt the stock, but froze the assets? What if I could prove insider trading? If I exposed Lucas's short positions after the crash started, the SEC wouldn't just fine him. They would put him in federal prison. And my father would be the CEO who oversaw the biggest corporate collapse since Enron. He would be ruined. His legacy would be dust. I looked at my reflection in the glass. The woman staring back at me didn't look like a daughter anymore. She looked like a CEO. If they want to push me down, I whispered to the glass, why should I catch them when they fall? I turned back to the e-reader. I picked it up. My fingers hovered over the keys. Knox, I typed. Initiate protocol, 0 day, target, Vanguard Horizon. Prepare to leak transactional metadata to the SEC and the Financial Times. Hold for my command. Command acknowledged. Holding. I wasn't going to stop the signing. I was going to let them sign the death warrant. And then, I was going to make sure the execution was public, painful, and permanent. I went to the bedroom and lay down on the silk sheets. For the first time all day, I smiled. I closed my eyes and slept like a baby, while the little plastic device on the nightstand waited to destroy $19 billion worth of lies. The digital ink on the screen of my modified e-reader refreshed with a slowness that felt like torture. In a world of fiber optics and nanosecond trading, I was conducting the most important investigation of my life at the speed of a dial-up connection, but speed did not matter anymore. Accuracy was the only currency that held any value in this room. It was 3 a.m. The city outside was asleep, a sprawling grid of darkness and streetlights, but the data Knox was pulling was wide awake and screaming. I had moved past Lucas. His betrayal was a simple, greedy calculation. What I needed to understand now was the structural integrity of the bomb my father was about to hug. I instructed Knox to stop looking at the people and start looking at the plumbing. I wanted to see the supply chain, the vendor contracts, and the legal bedrock of logic systems. The results began to populate the screen, a cascading waterfall of plain text that painted a picture of absolute catastrophe. Knox had managed to triangulate public shipping manifests with court dockets from 3 different jurisdictions. Logic Systems claimed to have a revolutionary proprietary hardware network, a series of automated distribution hubs that were the crown jewel of the $19 billion valuation. They touted these hubs as their own, fully paid for and operational. But Knox found a discrepancy in the property tax records. Logic Systems did not own the hubs. They did not even lease them directly. The entire physical infrastructure was contracted out to a third-party entity called Apex Logistics. On the surface, this looked like standard outsourcing, but Knox dug deeper, cross-referencing Apex's tax ID with bankruptcy filings in the state of Nevada. Apex Logistics was insolvent. They had filed for Chapter 11 protection quietly under a sealed motion 2 days ago. The moment the judge lifted that seal, which was scheduled for Monday morning, Apex would cease operations, the trucks would stop, the warehouses would lock their doors. The proprietary hardware my father thought he was buying would be seized by creditors. I felt a cold sweat prickle at the back of my neck. The timing was surgical. The merger was set to sign on Friday. The bankruptcy would go public on Monday. For 48 hours over the weekend, my father would think he owned the future of shipping. By Monday morning, he would own an empty shell company whose primary operational arm had been amputated. But why didn't the due diligence team see this? I queried the legal team's correspondence log, which Knox was scraping from the metadata of shared documents. I found the answer buried in a waiver. The general counsel for Anderson Global had flagged a potential vendor stability issue 3 weeks ago. My father had overridden it. He had marked the concern as immaterial to expedite the closing process. He was not just blind, he was willfully closing his eyes. I needed to know why. Why was Robert Anderson, a man who once spent 6 months negotiating the price of office furniture, rushing a $19 billion deal with such reckless desperation? I directed Knox to pivot. I told it to look at my father, not the CEO, but the man. I told it to pull the Uniform Commercial Code filings under his personal name, searching for liens and collateral pledges. The screen flickered, the data loaded, and then the floor dropped out from under me. There it was. A secured loan agreement filed 4 months ago with a private equity consortium in Zurich. Robert Anderson had not just used the company's war chest to fund the cash portion of this merger. He had leveraged himself. He had pledged 40% of his personal equity in Anderson Global Holdings as collateral for a high-risk bridge loan to sweeten the pot. I stared at the glowing green text, my hand covering my mouth. He was liquidity poor. He had tied up all his cash in real estate and vanity projects. So to make this deal happen, he had bet the house, literally. The terms of the loan were predatory. If the stock price of Anderson Global dipped below a certain threshold, a threshold that was terrifyingly close to the current trading price, the lenders had the right to seize his shares. They could execute a margin call that would strip him of his controlling interest in the company he founded. It all made sense now. The rush, the anger, the refusal to listen to negative news. He was terrified. He needed the Logic Systems deal to close so the stock price would spike on the news. He needed that bump to refinance his personal loan and get his shares out of the danger zone. He was not building a legacy. He was trying to outrun a debt collector. And Lucas? My God. Lucas. If Lucas successfully shorted the stock and drove the price down, he would not just make money. He would trigger the margin call on our father. He would be the one handing the executioner the axe to chop off Robert's head. Lucas was not just betting against the company. He was engineering a coup to strip our father of his voting rights. I felt a wave of nausea. This was not business. This was patricide by spreadsheet. I forced myself to keep reading. There had to be more. If the deal went through, surely there were protections. Escrow accounts, clawback clauses if the target company turned out to be a fraud. I pulled up the draft of the merger agreement, specifically the disbursement schedule. Clause 14B. Upon signature and transfer of title, 80% of the cash consideration shall be wired immediately to the seller's designated offshore accounts. The remaining 20% shall be held in escrow for a period of 30 days. 80%, immediate wire transfer. Usually, in a deal this size, you hold back at least half until the integration is complete. But my father, in his desperation to close, had agreed to hand over $15 billion in cash the second the ink was dry. The moment he signed that paper on Friday, $15 billion would leave our accounts and vanish into a network of shell companies in the Cayman Islands. By Monday, when the apex bankruptcy hit and the fraud was revealed, the money would be gone. We would be left with a $19 billion debt, a bankrupt subsidiary, and a stock price in freefall. The company would face lawsuits from every angle. Shareholders would sue for breach of fiduciary duty. The SEC would launch a criminal probe. The lenders in Zurich would seize my father's shares. Anderson Global Holdings, a pillar of American industry for 50 years, would be carved up and sold for scrap within 6 months. I sat back against the bookshelf, the plastic casing of the e-reader digging into my palms. The silence of the penthouse felt different now. It was no longer a prison, it was a bomb shelter. I switched Knox to a different sector. Public relations. I wanted to see the narrative they had constructed for the end of the world. Accessing the external marketing server was easy. They used default passwords for their draft folders. I found a folder named Victory Day. Inside were press releases dated for Friday afternoon. Robert Anderson, the visionary who redefined logistics, a new era. Anderson Global acquires logic systems for record $19 billion. Lucas Anderson to lead integration team, hailed as architect of the deal. They had the champagne on ice. They had the interviews scheduled with CNBC and Bloomberg. They had written their own eulogies and were planning to read them as victory speeches. I looked at the timestamps. These drafts had been approved by my father personally yesterday morning, while I was in his office begging him to look at the fraud. He was editing quotes about his own genius. I had enough. I had the supply chain collapse. I had the personal leverage. I had the contract trap. I had the roadmap of the apocalypse. My finger hovered over the reply all button on the company email server. I could blast this to the entire board of directors right now. I could send it to the New York Times. I could blow the whistle so loud it would shatter the windows of this penthouse. But then I stopped. I thought about the employees, not the executives in the C-suite with their golden parachutes, but the 40,000 people who worked in our warehouses, our call centers, our regional offices. If I went nuclear now, if I leaked this before the signing, the chaos might be even worse. The stock would crash on the rumor alone. The uncertainty would cause a run on the company. My father would spin it, blame me, claim I was a disgruntled daughter sabotaging the family. He might even survive it by finding a way to bury the evidence and fire me. And if he survived, he would learn nothing. He would do it again. But if I let him sign, the money would be lost. Yes, but the truth would be undeniable. The fraud would be a matter of public record. The problem was the collateral damage. When the ship sank, the crew would drown. I needed a way to protect the innocent without saving the guilty. I typed a new command into Knox. Protocol. Lifeboat. I instructed the AI to scrape and archive every single piece of data I had found. Every email where the general counsel warned of risk. Every memo where the CFO questioned the valuation. Every arrogant dismissal from my father. Every trade Lucas made. I was building a digital fortress. When the lawsuit started, when the employees lost their pensions and the shareholders lost their savings, they would come looking for someone to blame. They would try to blame the mid-level managers. They would try to blame the auditors. I would give them the real targets. I would make sure that the evidence existed to prove that this was not an accident. It was negligence. It was malice. This data would be the shield for the innocent employees to sue for severance, and the sword that would pierce the corporate veil protecting my father and brother. I wasn't going to stop the car from driving off the cliff. I was just going to make sure the black box survived the crash. I looked at the time, 4:15 in the morning. The sun would be coming up soon over the East River. The gala was tonight. My father had banned me from attending, intending to punish me by denying me the spotlight. He didn't realize that the spotlight was exactly where the danger was. Archive complete. Knox flashed on the screen. Data encrypted and stored on remote servers. I powered down the e-reader and hid it back inside the hollowed-out book on the shelf. I walked to the bedroom window. The city was waking up. Delivery trucks were moving on the avenues below. trucks that belonged to a fleet my father thought he was revolutionizing, but was actually about to destroy. My mother's words echoed in my head. Keep the family intact. That was impossible now. The family was a fiction. We were just a collection of competing interests held together by a trust fund. I felt a strange sense of calm. I was done trying to be the savior. I was done trying to be the good daughter. If they wanted to burn the empire down for their own egos, I would let them hold the matches. I would just make sure I was the one holding the fire extinguisher when the smoke cleared. I went to bed, but I didn't close the curtains. I wanted to watch the sun rise on the last day of the Anderson dynasty. The check was about to be written, and I was the only one who knew it would bounce. The dress was hanging in the back of my closet, wrapped in plastic like a corpse. It was a vintage piece, a floor-length sheath of midnight blue velvet that looked black under low light, with a neckline that plunged just deep enough to be dangerous. I had bought it in Paris 3 years ago but never found an occasion worthy of its severity. Tonight, however, it was perfect. It was not a dress for a celebration. It was a dress for a wake. My father had grounded me. He had stripped me of my digital identity and placed a guard at my door. But Robert Anderson, for all his billions, had a blind spot for the mundane mechanics of his own world. He assumed that security systems were infallible walls. I knew they were just software, and software needed to update. Every Thursday at 7 o'clock in the evening, the building's biometric server performed a rolling restart. It was a 60-second window where the electronic locks defaulted to a mechanical fail-safe mode to prevent entrapment in case of a fire. It was a safety feature I had insisted on when I sat on the building committee 5 years ago. I watched the analog clock on the wall. The second hand swept past the 12. 7 o'clock. I walked to the service entrance in the kitchen, not the main elevator where Ralph the guard was likely dozing in his folding chair. I turned the handle. It clicked. The heavy fire door swung open without a sound. I slipped into the concrete stairwell, my heels in my hand, the velvet of my dress brushing against the cold. Painted cinder blocks. I descended 60 flights of stairs in my stocking feet, the silence of the stairwell amplifying the pounding of my heart. By the time I reached the garage level, I was breathless, but I was free. I didn't take my car. The transponder would alert security. I hailed a yellow taxi on the corner of 57th Street. The driver, a man with tired eyes, didn't look twice at the woman in the ball gown sliding into his back seat. The Pierre Hotel, I said. The annual Anderson Global Gala was the kind of event that made the society pages look like understated pamphlets. It was a convergence of old money, new tech wealth, and the politicians who fed off both. The ballroom was a cavern of gold leaf and crystal chandeliers, filled with the scent of expensive lilies and even more expensive ambition. I walked in through the side entrance near the orchestra, flashing a smile at a security guard who recognized me from a dozen previous events. He didn't know I was a prisoner. To him, I was just Trinity Anderson, running late. The room was a sea of black tuxedos and glittering gowns. The noise was a dull roar of polite laughter and clinking glass. I stood in the shadows of a marble pillar for a moment, just watching. It was fascinating to see them from this angle. They were eating canapés and drinking vintage champagne, celebrating a merger that was actually a suicide pact. They looked so confident. They looked so safe. I stepped into the light. The reaction was not immediate. It rippled outward from the point of my entry, a wave of silence that moved across the room as heads turned. I did not shrink. I did not look like a woman who had been locked in her room. I walked with the slow, predatory grace of someone who owned the floorboards beneath her feet. On the stage at the far end of the room, my father was standing at the podium. He looked magnificent in the spotlight, the very image of American success. He was holding a glass of champagne aloft, midway through his toast. "To a future," he was saying, his voice booming over the speakers, "that knows no boundaries, to a partnership that redefines." He saw me. The sentence died in his throat. It wasn't a subtle pause. He choked on the words. The glass in his hand wavered, spilling a few drops of gold liquid onto his cuff. For a second, the mask of the invincible CEO slipped, and beneath it was the confusion of a father who realized his discipline had failed. The silence in the room deepened. The guests looked from him to me, sensing the tension but not understanding the source. I didn't wave. I didn't smile. I just stood there, 50 feet away, holding his gaze. "I am here," my eyes said, "and I know." Robert recovered quickly, clearing his throat and forcing a tight smile that didn't reach his eyes. "To the future," he finished hastily, drinking the toast. The applause was polite but hesitant. I moved toward the bar. Before I could reach it, a hand clamped onto my upper arm. It was firm, painful, and familiar. "What do you think you are doing?" Lucas hissed in my ear. I turned to look at my brother. He was sweating. Tiny beads of perspiration had gathered on his upper lip, betraying the nerves he hid under his tailored suit. He looked at me as if I were a bomb that had just rolled into a nursery. "Hello, Lucas," I said, my voice cool and level. "You look flushed. Is the air conditioning not working, or is it just the leverage?" He squeezed my arm harder, trying to steer me toward the exit. "You are not supposed to be here. Dad said you were grounded. If he sees you making a scene—" "He already saw me," I interrupted, pulling my arm free with a sharp jerk. "And I am not making a scene. I am having a drink." "You are insane," Lucas whispered, his eyes darting around to see if anyone was listening. "Go home, Trinity, before security drags you out." "Security won't touch me," I said, leaning in close enough to smell the whiskey on his breath. "Because if they do, I might start screaming. And if I start screaming, I might accidentally yell out the strike price of your put options." Lucas went pale. The color drained from his face so fast he looked like he might faint. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. He knew. He knew that I knew. "That's what I thought," I said, turning my back on him. I walked away, leaving him paralyzed by his own guilt. I navigated the room, nodding to people I had known since childhood, accepting compliments on my dress with a distant smile. I wasn't aimless. I had a target. Standing near the ice sculpture was Arthur Sterling. Arthur was the head of the pension fund that held the largest institutional block of Anderson Global stock. He was a cautious man, a man who wore suspenders and checked the weather report 3 times before leaving the house. He was the bellwether. If Arthur got scared, the herd would stampede. "Trinity," Arthur beamed as I approached. "We missed you during the cocktail hour. Your father said you were under the weather." "My father exaggerates," I said, taking a glass of sparkling water from a passing tray. "I have never felt more clear-headed." "Good, good," Arthur nodded. "Exciting times, eh? 19 billion. It is a bold move, a legacy move." I took a sip of water, letting the silence stretch just long enough to be uncomfortable. I looked Arthur directly in the eyes. "It is certainly bold," I said softly. "Arthur, tell me, when you did your site visits for the diligence, did you actually go to Nevada?" Arthur blinked, confused by the specificity of the question. "Nevada? Well, no. The diligence team handled the site visits. Why?" I smiled, a thin, enigmatic expression that gave nothing away and yet implied everything. "Oh, nothing. I just find the desert fascinating this time of year. Things disappear so easily out there. Warehouses, assets. It is amazing what a mirage can hide." Arthur frowned. The jovial lines around his eyes tightened. "Trinity, is there something I should know? We are voting our shares in favor of this deal based on the asset audits." "I am sure the audits are immaculate," I said, keeping my voice low. "But paper is just paper. Arthur, sometimes you have to kick the tires, or in this case, check if the tires are even attached to the truck." I didn't wait for him to ask a follow-up. I saw the doubt bloom in his eyes. It was a small, nagging seed, but by morning, it would be a vine choking his confidence. He would make a phone call. He would ask a question. And when he didn't get a straight answer, the panic would set in. "Enjoy the evening, Arthur," I said, patting his arm. I turned and walked toward the exit. I could feel my father's eyes burning a hole in my back from across the room. I could feel Lucas's terror radiating from the corner where I had left him. I didn't stay for the main course. I didn't stay for the dancing. I had done what I came to do. I had shown them that walls could not hold me. I had shown them that their secrets were not safe. As I stepped out onto Fifth Avenue, the night air was cold and sharp. I took a deep breath, filling my lungs with the smog and the energy of the city. Behind me, in the Golden Ballroom, the music was playing, but the rhythm had changed. I had introduced a discord. They would spend the rest of the night wondering what I meant. They would spend the next 2 days looking over their shoulders. I hailed another cab. "Where to, lady?" the driver asked. "Back to the cage," I said. I had planted the seeds. Now, all I had to do was go back to my room, sit in the dark, and wait for the rain. The signing was in 36 hours. Let them have their party. The hangover was going to be legendary. Friday morning arrived with the sterile precision of an operating theater. The sky over Manhattan was a bleached white, the kind of colorless glare that made skyscrapers look like tombstones. I was standing in the grand hall of the Anderson Global Headquarters, a space designed to intimidate. The ceilings were 40 feet high, and the walls were lined with portraits of men who had died rich. Today, my father intended to hang his own legacy next to theirs. I had been escorted from my penthouse at 8 o'clock in the morning by the same security detail that had imprisoned me. They did not handcuff me. Of course, that would ruin the optic. Instead, they dressed me in a cream-colored suit that screamed "compliant heiress" and walked me down to the waiting limousine. My role today was simple. I was the silent affirmation. My presence was meant to signal to the market that the Anderson family was united, that the rumors of internal dissent were baseless, and that the $19 billion acquisition of Logic Systems had the full blessing of the bloodline. They placed me to the left of the stage, just out of the blinding wash of the television lights, but visible enough for the cameras to catch my profile. I stood with my hands clasped in front of me, a statue of obedience. On the stage, the tableau was set, a long mahogany table, 2 heavy leather chairs, flags of the United States, and the corporate logos draped in the background. My father, Robert Anderson, sat on the right. He looked revitalized. The fear I had seen in his eyes in the study, the desperation that had driven him to leverage his own soul, was gone. It had been replaced by the intoxicating high of the deal. He was about to sign the biggest contract of the decade. He believed he had won. Next to him sat the CEO of Logic Systems, a man named Vance, who had the slippery, polished look of a salesman who couldn't believe his luck, and hovering behind them, leaning one hand on our father's chair like a crown prince, was Lucas. Lucas caught my eye from the stage. He smirked. It was a microscopic movement, a slight curl of the lip that said, "I told you so." He checked his watch, probably calculating how many minutes were left until the stock price spiked and he could double down on his short position before the inevitable crash. He thought he was playing a double game. He didn't realize he was playing solitaire in a burning building. "Ladies and gentlemen," the director of communications announced into the microphone, "please silence your devices. The signing ceremony will commence in 2 minutes." I felt the weight of the small, haptic device taped to the inside of my wrist, hidden beneath the cuff of my blazer. It was a simple Bluetooth transmitter I had scavenged from the guts of the penthouse security panel before I left. It had one button, one function. It was paired to the e-reader I had left powered on and hidden in the library, communicating via a long-range frequency I had hijacked from the building's maintenance network. My father picked up the pen. It was a gold-plated fountain pen, heavy and archaic. He uncapped it with a flourish. The shutter sounds of 50 professional cameras erupted simultaneously, a machine gun rattle of captured history. "This is a great day for American industry," Robert said, his voice booming for the microphones. "By combining the resources of Anderson Global with the technological infrastructure of Logic Systems, we are not just buying a company, we are buying the future." He lowered the pen to the paper. I watched the nib touch the document. I watched the ink flow. I watched him sign his name, the sweeping, aggressive signature that had authorized layoffs, mergers, and hostile takeovers for 40 years. He passed the document to Vance. Vance signed. It was done. The legal transfer was initiated. The $15 billion wire transfer was queued in the system, waiting for the final digital handshake. I took a slow breath. I didn't look at my father. I looked at the sea of people in the front row, the lawyers, the investment bankers from Goldman and Morgan, the representatives from the Zurich Lending Consortium who held the lien on my father's personal shares. I pressed the button on my wrist. It was a small click, inaudible over the applause that had just broken out. But in the digital world, I had just detonated a nuclear warhead. Knox executed the command. The script I had written was not a leak to the press. That was too slow. That was too messy. This was a targeted legal strike. Knox instantly sent a high-priority, encrypted data packet to the compliance officers, general counsels, and risk management directors of every single financial institution involved in this deal. The subject line was not sensational. It was terrifyingly bureaucratic. Notice of material adverse event. Undisclosed insolvency and fraudulent conveyance. Attached to the email were the bankruptcy filings for Apex Logistics, the tax records proving Logic Systems owned no physical assets, and the internal memos from my father overriding the risk warnings. For 10 seconds, the applause continued. My father stood up, shaking Vance's hand. Lucas was clapping, his eyes gleaming with greed. Then, the sound began. It started in the front row. A cell phone vibrated against a wooden table. Then another. Then a distinct, sharp ping of a priority notification. Then a pocket buzzed. It wasn't the scattered noise of people forgetting to silence their phones. It was a synchronized wave. Every lawyer, every banker, every compliance officer in the room received the notification at the exact same second. The applause faltered. I watched the general counsel for Anderson Global, a man named Marcus, who had been with the company for 20 years. He reached into his pocket, frowning, annoyed by the interruption. He looked at his screen. His face didn't just pale. It went gray. He stopped clapping. He froze, his eyes widening as he scrolled. He looked up at the stage, then back at his phone, then frantically tapped on the shoulder of the external counsel sitting next to him. "What is it?" I heard someone whisper in the sudden lull. On stage, my father was still smiling, posing for a photo. "Let's get one with the whole team," he called out, oblivious. But the team wasn't coming up to the stage. The lead representative from the Zurich Bank stood up. He wasn't looking at the stage. He was typing furiously on his BlackBerry. He whispered something to his associate, who immediately grabbed a briefcase and stood up as well. The room's energy shifted from celebration to confusion, and then, sharply, to dread. It was palpable, like the drop in pressure before a tornado. Lucas noticed it first. His smile faltered. He looked down at the front row. "Is there a problem?" he asked, his voice amplified by the microphone, sounding tinny and uncertain. Marcus, our general counsel, stood up. He didn't look at Lucas. He looked at my father. "Mr. Anderson," he said, his voice shaking. We have a situation." "What situation?" Robert snapped, the smile vanishing. "We are in the middle of a press conference. Sit down, Marcus." "I cannot sit down, sir," Marcus said, and for the first time in his career, he interrupted the boss. He held up his phone. "We just received a compliance alert. It appears to be a verified court docket from Nevada." "Nevada?" Robert frowned. "What are you talking about?" "It says Apex Logistics filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy 48 hours ago," Marcus said. The silence in the room was absolute. You could hear the hum of the air conditioning. "And it says Logic Systems is listed as the primary unsecured creditor with zero collateral." The CEO of Logic Systems, Vance, dropped his glass of water. It shattered on the hardwood stage, the sound exploding like a gunshot. "That is a lie," Vance stammered, but his face was the color of chalk. That is a competitor rumor." "It is a court filing, Vance," a banker from the second row shouted, standing up and waving his tablet. I am looking at the judge's signature right now. The timestamp is from Tuesday. The press corps smelled blood. The cameras that had been pointed at the handshake suddenly swung toward the audience, then zoomed in on Vance's sweating face. "Hold on!" Robert roared, stepping to the edge of the stage. "Everyone calm down. This is a misunderstanding. We did our due diligence." "Did you?" The voice came from the Zurich banker. He stepped into the aisle. "Because I just received an internal memo with your digital signature on it, Mr. Anderson, overriding the vendor stability warning 3 weeks ago. Did you or did you not know that the supply chain was insolvent?" Robert recoiled as if he had been slapped. I... If you knew," the banker continued, his voice icy, "and you signed this contract anyway, that is bank fraud. That triggers the default clause on your personal leverage immediately." "No!" Lucas shouted, stepping forward. He looked frantic. "That is fake. Someone hacked the system. This is a setup." He looked at me. For a split second, amidst the chaos, Lucas looked at me. He saw me standing there, perfectly still, perfectly calm. I wasn't checking my phone. I wasn't looking around in confusion. I was watching them. My eyes met his. I didn't smirk. I didn't smile. I just blinked. Once, slowly. "I warned you," my look said. "I told you the tire was rotten. You chose to drive the car." "Trinity!" Lucas yelled, pointing a trembling finger at me. "She did this. She is the one. She hacked the files." The cameras swung toward me. 100 lenses focused on the billionaire's daughter standing in the shadows. I didn't flinch. I walked forward, stepping out of the shadows and into the harsh light of the stage. I didn't take the stairs. I stopped in front of the press pit. "My brother seems distressed," I said, my voice clear and projecting without a microphone. "But facts are not hacks. Lucas, is Apex Logistics bankrupt?" I turned to Vance. He was trembling. He couldn't answer. "Is it true, Dad?" I asked, looking up at the man on the stage. "Did you override the safety warnings to close the deal?" Robert Anderson looked down at me. For the first time in my life, I saw him look small, the giant, the titan. The man who had grounded me in my own home was shrinking before my eyes. He opened his mouth to roar, to command, to dismiss, but nothing came out. He looked at the documents on the phones of the lawyers. He looked at the shattered glass on the floor. "The wire transfer!" someone shouted from the back. "Stop the wire!" "It is too late," a voice replied. "The contract is signed. The system auto-executed." Pandemonium broke loose. Lawyers were shouting into phones. Traders were screaming sell orders. The reporters were shouting questions, climbing over chairs to get closer to the stage. Robert stood frozen in the center of the storm. Lucas grabbed his hair, pulling at it, his eyes wild. "My puts," he whispered, too low for the mic, but loud enough for me to read his lips. "It is happening too fast. They will freeze the trading." He was right. The stock wasn't just going to crash. It was going to be halted. The exchange would suspend trading pending an investigation. He wouldn't be able to cash out his short position. He would be trapped in the investigation just like everyone else. I stood in the eye of the hurricane. The wheel had turned. The collapse I had predicted had arrived, not in months, but in seconds. And I was the only one in the room who wasn't afraid. Because I was the only one who had nothing left to lose. It took exactly 11 minutes for $3 billion of market capitalization to evaporate. I was back in the penthouse. The security detail had hustled me out of the grand hall the moment the shouting started, treating me like a volatile chemical that needed to be contained. They drove me back to the apartment in silence, their knuckles white on the steering wheel, radios chattering with panic codes I didn't recognize. They locked the door behind me, but this time, the isolation felt different. It was not a punishment. It was the eye of the storm. I turned on the television in the living room. Every financial news network was broadcasting the same image. A looping clip of Vance dropping his water glass on the stage, followed by the frantic scrolling of the ticker at the bottom of the screen. The arrow next to Anderson Global was red, pointing straight down, shedding value with the speed of a falling knife. The headlines were brutal. Anderson, global merger, halted amid fraud allegations. Logic systems insolvent. Documents reveal billion-dollar oversight. Who knew? SEC launches preliminary inquiry. My father's face was plastered on every screen, but it wasn't the triumphant portrait he had commissioned. It was a grainy, zoomed-in shot from moments ago, looking confused and small as his empire crumbled around him. My landline began to ring. It was the only phone I had access to, and it was supposed to be for internal family emergencies only. I didn't answer it. I let it ring. It stopped, then started again immediately. I knew who was calling. It wasn't my mother. It was the bank in Zurich. They were calling the house, the office, the cell phones, and now, in their desperation, they were calling the unlisted lines. They wanted their collateral. They wanted to know if the 40% of the company my father had pledged was still worth the paper it was printed on. It wasn't. At 2:00 in the afternoon, the elevator chimed. The doors slid open with a violent jerk, as if someone had hit the button repeatedly. Lucas stormed into the apartment. He looked like a man who had been chased by wolves. His tie was gone, his top button was undone, and his hair, usually lacquered into submission, was wild. He was holding a tablet in one hand and a phone in the other, and he was shouting before he even cleared the foyer. "What did you send them?" he screamed, his voice cracking. "What the hell did you send them? Trinity?" I was sitting on the beige leather sofa, a cup of tea in my hand. I placed it gently on the coaster. "I sent them the truth. Lucas, I sent them the documents Dad refused to read." Lucas marched over and threw the tablet onto the coffee table. It slid across the glass surface and stopped inches from my tea. The screen displayed a live feed of the stock price. It was down 22% and halted for volatility. "You killed us," he spat, pacing the room. "The board is convening an emergency session. The lenders are invoking the material adverse change clause. They are talking about liquidation. Trinity, liquidation. Do you know what that means? It means zero. It means we lose the houses, the jets, the foundation, everything." "We were going to lose it anyway," I said calmly. "If the deal had gone through, we would be facing federal indictments for securities fraud. At least this way. The wound is clean." "Clean?" Lucas laughed, a hysterical, high-pitched sound. "You call this clean? Dad is in the infirmary. He had chest pains in the limo. Mom is sobbing in the bathroom. And I am trying to hold back a tidal wave with a teaspoon." I looked at him, really looked at him. Beneath the anger, I saw the terror. It wasn't the fear of a son worrying about his father's health. It was the fear of a gambler who realizes the casino is locking the doors. "You are not worried about the foundation, Lucas," I said softly. He stopped pacing. He turned to me, his eyes narrowing. "What?" "You are not worried about the liquidation," I continued, standing up slowly. "You are worried about the timing because the stock didn't crash enough, did it?" Lucas froze. The air in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. "I don't know what you are talking about." "Vanguard Horizon," I said. The name hit him like a physical blow. He took a step back, his heel catching on the edge of the rug. "I know you opened the short position 3 months ago," I said, walking toward him. "I know you leveraged your personal assets to bet against the family. You bought put options with a strike price of $40. You needed the stock to plummet. Lucas, you wanted it to fail. You just wanted it to fail on your schedule, after you had secured your exit." Lucas's face went from red to a ghostly white. He looked at the security camera in the corner of the room, terrified that someone was listening. You hacked my accounts," he whispered. "That is illegal. You can't prove that." "I didn't hack anything," I lied smoothly. "I just looked at the data you left trailing behind you like breadcrumbs. You were betting against Dad. You were going to let him sign that deal, let him take the fall, and then get rich off the wreckage." "I was hedging," Lucas shouted, his defense crumbling into a confession. "It was a hedge. I knew he was out of control. I knew the deal was bad. I was trying to protect my share. You were protecting yourself, I corrected him. And now you are trapped, because trading is halted. You can't close your position. And when the SEC starts looking at who made big bets right before the collapse, whose name do you think is going to pop up? Vanguard Horizon links back to your trust in the Caymans. Lucas, it took me 4 minutes to find it. How long do you think it will take the feds? Lucas looked at his phone. His hands were shaking so hard the device was vibrating. He was doing the math. He realized that if he was caught shorting his own company while sitting on the board, he wasn't just broke. He was going to prison for insider trading. He needed a way out. He needed to confuse the narrative. He needed to make it look like he was defending the company, not betting against it. I have to fix this, he muttered, tapping frantically on his screen. I have to show confidence. If I show confidence, maybe they won't look at the trades. Lucas, don't, I warned, seeing the manic look in his eyes. Don't do anything. Just sit down. Shut up, he snapped. You caused this. I am the one who has to save it. He opened his social media app. He had 2 million followers. He started typing. What are you doing? I asked. I am issuing a denial, he said, his thumbs flying across the glass. I am telling them the documents are fake, that it is a cyber attack, that the company is solvent and we are buying back shares. Lucas, that is market manipulation, I said, my voice sharp. The documents are real. If you lie to the market right now, while the stock is halted, you are digging your own grave. I am the COO, he yelled. People trust me. If I say it is a lie, the stock stabilizes. The investigation slows down. I can close the shorts when the market reopens. He hit send. I watched him do it. I watched him press the blue button that sealed his fate. Tweet sent. Rumors of insolvency are false. The documents circulating are part of a coordinated cyber attack on Anderson Global. We are financially strong and will be initiating a share buyback immediately. Do not panic. It was a desperate, stupid move. It was the move of a man who thought he could bend reality with his influence. For 30 seconds, nothing happened. Then, the television screen flickered. The news anchor put a hand to her ear. Breaking news, she said, her voice rising in excitement. Lucas Anderson, COO of Anderson Global, has just issued a statement on social media claiming the leak is a cyber attack and promising a share buyback. Lucas looked at me, a triumphant grin twisting his face. See? I told you. I control the narrative. But the anchor wasn't finished. However, she continued, we are receiving reports from the New York Stock Exchange. The regulators are flagging this statement. Anderson Global does not have the liquidity for a buyback. Their credit lines were frozen 20 minutes ago by the Zurich Consortium. Lucas's smile vanished. And, the anchor added, looking down at a new paper handed to her, the court in Nevada has just issued a formal confirmation. The bankruptcy of the subsidiary is valid. The judge has released the seal. Lucas Anderson's statement appears to be factually incorrect. The market reaction was instantaneous. Even though the main stock was halted, the futures market for the sector nosedived. The credibility of the entire executive board evaporated in seconds. Lucas hadn't just lied. He had lied while the truth was being projected on a 10-foot screen behind him. My landline rang again. I walked over and picked it up this time. I put it on speaker. This is the General Counsel, Marcus's voice came through, sounding exhausted and terrified. Is Lucas there? Lucas stared at the phone, paralyzed. He is here, I said. Lucas, Marcus said, his voice cold. The SEC just called. They saw your tweet. They are opening a formal investigation into market manipulation and dissemination of false information. They are sending a team to the office. They want your hard drives. And Lucas, they specifically asked about a fund called Vanguard Horizon. Lucas dropped his phone. It hit the hardwood floor with a heavy thud. The room was silent, save for the drone of the television. He had tried to play God, and he had just confirmed to the world that he was a devil. You should probably call a lawyer, I said, sitting back down on the sofa. Not the company lawyer, a criminal defense lawyer. Lucas looked at me with pure hatred, but the fire was gone. He was a hollow shell. He turned and ran out of the apartment, presumably to shred documents that were already backed up on my server. I took a sip of my tea. It was still warm. The first domino had knocked down the second. My father was incapacitated by the shock. My brother had just incriminated himself on a global stage. The empire was not just falling, it was being dismantled from the inside out. And I hadn't lifted a finger since I pressed the button on my wrist. I was just the audience now, and the show was far from over. The sun had begun to set, casting long, bruised shadows of purple and orange across the floor of the penthouse. The city below was likely in chaos. Reporters camped outside the headquarters, analysts screaming on cable news, employees refreshing their inboxes in terror. But up here, 60 stories above the pavement, the air was still. It was the heavy, suffocating stillness of a tomb. I was standing by the window, watching the lights of the bridges flicker on, when the elevator door opened for the third time that day. I did not turn around. I knew who it was. The heavy, deliberate cadence of the footsteps was as familiar to me as my own heartbeat. It was a walk that had terrified board members for 4 decades. It was the walk of a man who believed the earth was obligated to hold him up. My father, Robert Anderson, walked into the room. He did not shout. He did not throw things. The rage I had seen in his study 2 days ago, the red-faced bluster of a tyrant denied, had evaporated. In its place was something far more unsettling, a cold, clinical detachment. He looked like a man who had just walked away from a fatal car crash and was calmly checking his watch to see if he would be late for dinner. He walked past me to the wet bar. He didn't offer me a drink. He poured himself a glass of water, his hand steady, though his skin had a gray, papery quality to it that I had never seen before. "The stock is down 60% in after-hours trading," he said. His voice was flat, a recitation of facts. "The New York Stock Exchange will not reopen our ticker tomorrow. They are delisting us pending the federal audit." I turned to face him. He was still wearing his suit from the signing ceremony, but the flower in his lapel was wilted. "I know," I said. "The Zurich Consortium called," he continued, taking a sip of water. "They are exercising the margin clauses. They are seizing the voting shares at 9 o'clock tomorrow morning. They will own the controlling interest of Anderson Global. They have already appointed an interim management team. They asked me to vacate the building by noon." He set the glass down. It made a sharp click on the marble counter. "Lucas is currently hiding in the legal department," he said, finally looking at me. "He is shredding documents. It won't matter. The FBI served a warrant for the servers 20 minutes ago. They are entering the building now." He listed the destruction of his life's work as if he were reading a grocery list. It was a defense mechanism. I realized, if he turned it into data, into cold numbers, he didn't have to feel the shame. "Why are you here, Dad?" I asked. He walked around the sofa and stood in the center of the room. He looked at the locked door, then at the darkened hallway where my room was. He looked at the space he had designated as my prison. "I want to know what you have," he said. It was the first time in 30 years he had asked me a question that wasn't rhetorical. "I don't understand," I said, though I understood perfectly. "Don't play games, Trinity," he said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous register. "You knew about the bankruptcy. You knew about Lucas's trades. You knew about the leverage. You didn't just guess. You had access." He took a step toward me. "I want to know exactly how much data you have regarding the internal accounting. I want to know if you have the emails from the last 3 quarters. I want to know if you have the shadow ledgers." I looked at him, feeling a sudden, sharp clarity. "I have everything." He stared at me, his eyes narrowing. He was assessing me, not as a daughter, but as an asset, or perhaps a liability. "Good," he said. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a flash drive. He tossed it onto the coffee table. "You are going to fix it," he said. I looked at the drive, then back at him. "Fix it?" "You are good with computers," he said. the dismissal in his tone making my stomach churn. "You have always been obsessed with your little systems, so use them. I want you to scrub the servers. I want you to create a digital paper trail that links the fraud to Vance at Logic Systems. Make it look like we were the victims of a sophisticated external hack. Make the emails disappear. You can do that. I know you can." I stared at him in disbelief. Even now, standing in the ashes of his empire. He thought he could command reality. He thought he could order me to rewrite the truth just because he was Robert Anderson and I was the child he had grounded. "You want me to commit a felony," I said. "You want me to obstruct a federal investigation and frame a third party to save you." "I am commanding you to save this family," he snapped, the facade of calm cracking for a second. "Do you have any idea what is going to happen if you don't? We lose everything. The estate, the reputation, your trust fund. It will all be gone. You will be on the street, Trinity, just like I told you." "I don't care about the money," I said quietly. "Everybody cares about the money," he roared. "Don't be naive. You think you are noble? You are just a spoiled child throwing a tantrum because I didn't let you sit at the big table. Well, congratulations. You flipped the table over. Now pick it up." I felt a cold anger rising in my chest, but I pushed it down. I needed to be the adult in the room. "Sit down," I said. "Excuse me?" I said. "Sit down," I repeated, my voice hard. "If you want to talk to me, you will sit down and speak to me like a human being, not a CEO, not a boss, and certainly not a father who locks his 30-year-old daughter in a penthouse." Robert looked at me, stunned. He opened his mouth to bark an order, but something in my face stopped him. He saw something he hadn't seen before. He saw that I wasn't looking for his approval anymore. He sat down. He sank into the beige leather armchair, looking suddenly smaller. "I am not going to scrub the servers," I said, remaining standing. "And I am not going to frame Vance. The data is already out. I sent copies to the SEC, the Department of Justice, and the Zurich Consortium. It is over." He flinched. You sent it to the DOJ?" "I had to," I said, "to protect myself, and to protect the employees you were willing to sacrifice." "I was protecting the company," he argued, his voice taking on a whining tone. "It was a bridge loan. Trinity, just a bridge. Once the merger went through, the stock would have jumped. I would have paid off the debt, and we would have fixed the supply chain issues. It was a calculated risk. That is what business is." "It wasn't a risk," I said. "It was a lie. And I told you. I walked into your office 3 days ago and I told you exactly what was going to happen. I brought you the file. I begged you to look at it." "You came in at the worst possible time," he muttered, looking away. "I came in with the truth," I said. "And what did you do? You tore it up. You laughed at me. You told Lucas to call security. You told me I was delusional. You locked me in this room and stripped me of my dignity because you couldn't stand the idea that I might be right." "I was under pressure," he said, waving a hand dismissively. "You don't understand the pressure. I understand that you bet the entire company on a fraud because you were too arrogant to admit you made a mistake," I said. "I understand that you let Lucas gamble with insider information because you were too busy looking at your own reflection to watch the shop. You did this, Dad, not me, not the banks, you." He looked up at me, his eyes wet with frustration and self-pity. "I built this. I built all of this from nothing. Doesn't that count for anything? Doesn't the fact that I gave you this life mean I deserve a little loyalty?" "Loyalty is not complicity," I said. "I tried to save you. That was loyalty. What you wanted was a co-conspirator." He stared at the flash drive on the table. He reached out and picked it up, his fingers trembling. "If you don't help me," he whispered, "I am going to prison." The words hung in the air. For the first time, he was admitting the reality. He wasn't afraid of losing the money. He was afraid of the cage. "Yes," I said, "you probably are." He looked at me with a look of pure betrayal. "I am your father." "And I am the daughter you grounded," I said. "You told me to stay in this room until I learned my lesson. Well, I learned it. I learned that if I don't stand up for the truth, you will sell it for a higher stock price. He stood up abruptly. The vulnerability vanished, replaced by a flash of the old hatred. You are ungrateful. You are a traitor. You think you have won? You have won nothing. You will be the queen of a pile of rubble. Better to rule the rubble than to serve the lie, I said. He glared at me, his jaw working. He wanted to scream. He wanted to hit me. He wanted to ground me for another 1,000 years. But he looked around the room and realized he had no guards to call. He had no leverage. He had no money. The penthouse didn't belong to him anymore. It belonged to the bank. The guards outside didn't work for him anymore. They worked for the receivership. He was a king without a kingdom, standing in the living room of the daughter he had underestimated. He straightened his jacket. He tried to summon the dignity of the billionaire Robert Anderson, but the image flickered. He just looked like an old man in a suit that was too expensive for his future. I will fight this, he said, his voice hollow. I have lawyers. I have friends in Washington. Your friends in Washington are currently deleting your number, I said, and your lawyers are negotiating their own immunity. He didn't respond. He couldn't. He knew I was right. He turned and walked toward the elevator. He moved slowly. His shoulders slumped. He pressed the button. Dad, I called out. He stopped, but he didn't turn around. You said I could leave this room when I learned my place, I said. The elevator doors opened. He stepped inside. I found my place, I said. It is the one sitting in the chair you just vacated. The doors closed. I stood alone in the penthouse. The silence returned. But it wasn't heavy anymore. It was light. It was clean. I walked over to the coffee table and picked up the flash drive he had left behind. I didn't plug it in. I walked to the kitchen, turned on the garbage disposal, and dropped it into the drain. The metal crunched and shrieked as it was ground into dust. My father had lost control. He had lost the narrative, and for the first time in 30 years, the air in the room belonged entirely to me. Saturday morning did not bring the weekend. It brought the executioners. They arrived in the form of a crisis management firm called Blackwood and Sterling. These were not the usual corporate lawyers with their soft handshakes and billable hours padded with lunch meetings. These were forensic accountants and liability specialists, people who wore gray suits and had eyes that looked like scanners. The board of directors had hired them at midnight on Friday, bypassing my father's authority entirely. It was the first official act of the coup. I received a summons via email at 7 o'clock in the morning. It was not a request. It was a directive. Ms. Anderson, you are required to present yourself in boardroom B at 900 hours for a preliminary interview regarding the solvency crisis. I dressed in a navy blue suit, sharp and unadorned. I pulled my hair back. I wore no jewelry. I looked in the mirror and saw the transformation complete. The heiress was gone. The witness had arrived. The headquarters was eerie. The lobby was empty of the usual weekend security staff, replaced by private contractors I did not recognize. They checked my ID against a list, their faces impassive. There was no, "Good morning, Miss Anderson." There was only a nod and a gesture toward the elevators. Boardroom B was on the 42nd floor, a level below the executive suites. It was a tactical choice. They were not meeting on my father's turf. When I walked in, the room was freezing. The air conditioning was blasting, a common interrogation tactic designed to make people uncomfortable, to make them want to leave, to make them speak faster. Around the long oval table sat the 12 members of the board of directors. These were men and women I had known my entire life. They had come to my birthday parties. They had given me graduation gifts. Now, they refused to meet my eyes. At the head of the table sat a woman I did not know. She was older, perhaps 60, with steel gray hair cut into a severe bob. She had a laptop open in front of her and a single yellow notepad. "Ms. Anderson," she said. She did not stand up. "I am Eleanor Vance, lead counsel for the independent investigation. Please, take a seat." She pointed to a chair at the far end of the table, isolated from the rest of the board. It felt less like a seat and more like a witness stand. "I am here to help," I said, my voice steady. cutting through the hum of the ventilation. "We will see," Eleanor said. She adjusted her glasses. "We are establishing a timeline of events leading up to the failed acquisition of logic systems. We need to determine who knew what, and when. We have already interviewed your father." I paused. "He is here?" "He is in the executive holding room," Arthur Sterling muttered from the side of the table. Arthur looked 10 years older than he had at the gala. His tie was crooked. He is contesting the authority of this committee." Mr. Anderson claims that the due diligence was sound and that the bankruptcy of the subsidiary was a sudden, unforeseeable event. Eleanor continued. Her eyes locked on mine. "He claims that any documents suggesting otherwise are fabrications created by a hostile party. Specifically, he has intimated that his daughter may be responsible for a digital sabotage campaign." The room went silent. The board members shifted in their seats. They were terrified. They were looking for a scapegoat, and my father had just served me up on a platter. I didn't flinch. I reached into my bag and pulled out a hard drive. It wasn't the one my father had given me to scrub. It was a clean drive containing the archive I had instructed Knox to compile. Protocol Lifeboat. "My father is a man under significant pressure," I said, placing the drive on the table. "But I prefer to let the metadata speak. This drive contains a mirror of the internal correspondence regarding the merger for the last 6 months." Eleanor signaled to an IT technician standing in the corner. He took the drive and plugged it into the projection system. "Please open the folder labeled Risk Assessment, Week 12, I instructed. The screen at the front of the room flickered to life. An email chain appeared. It was dated 3 weeks ago. "This is an email from the Chief Risk Officer to the CEO, I explained, standing up and walking slowly toward the screen. "As you can see, the subject line is Critical Vendor Instability. In the second paragraph, the risk officer explicitly states that Apex Logistics, the primary infrastructure provider for logic systems, had missed 3 consecutive debt payments and was flagged for potential insolvency." I pointed to the bottom of the email. "And here," I said, my finger hovering over the digital signature, "is Robert Anderson's reply, sent 14 minutes later." The board members leaned in. The reply read, "Noted, immaterial. Do not delay the signing. We will restructure them post-acquisition." "He knew," Arthur whispered. The color drained from his face. "He knew 3 weeks ago." "There is more," I said. "Open the folder labeled Personal Leverage." The technician clicked. A new document appeared. It was the loan agreement with the Zurich Consortium. My father pledged 40% of his voting shares to secure the bridge loan. I said, "Clause 7, subsection C, if the stock price drops below $80 a share, the collateral is forfeit." He didn't just risk the company's capital. He risked control of the board. He risked your seats. The room erupted in a low murmur. This was the betrayal that stung them the most. They could forgive a bad business deal. They could not forgive being pawned like cheap jewelry without their consent. "This is reckless endangerment of the corporation," one board member hissed. He had a fiduciary duty to disclose personal conflicts of interest. "He was desperate," I said, keeping my tone neutral. "He believed he could outrun the debt. He grounded me, confiscated my electronics, and placed me under house arrest because I tried to show him these numbers on Wednesday night." Eleanor looked up from her notepad. Her expression had shifted from skepticism to sharp interest. "He imprisoned you?" "He called it grounding," I said. "But yes, he placed a security detail at my door and cut off my communications to prevent me from alerting the board. He was afraid I would do exactly what I'm doing right now." "So you are the whistleblower," Eleanor stated. "I am a shareholder," I corrected her, "and I am a witness." "And what about your brother?" Eleanor asked. "Lucas Anderson. He claims he was following his father's lead. He claims he was a passive participant." I almost laughed. "Open the folder labeled Vanguard Horizon." The screen changed again. This time, it showed a complex web of transactions. "Lucas was not passive," I said. "He was active, aggressively active. These are trade logs from a shell company registered in the Cayman Islands. The beneficial owner is a trust linked to Lucas's social security number. Starting 90 days ago, he began buying put options against Anderson Global stock. I turned to the board. He was shorting the company. He knew the deal was toxic, and instead of stopping it, he positioned himself to profit from the collapse. He bet against every single person in this room. Arthur Sterling slammed his hand on the table. "That son of a bitch," he swore, abandoning all decorum. He was sitting in the strategy meetings, nodding along, while he was holding a knife to our throats. "That is insider trading," Eleanor said, her voice cold. "That is a federal crime. If this data is accurate, your brother is looking at 10 to 15 years in prison." "The data is accurate," I said, "and it is backed up on 3 independent servers. I have also provided copies to the Department of Justice." The silence that followed was heavy. The board members looked at me with a new expression. It wasn't fear, exactly. It was respect, or perhaps the realization that they had been underestimating the wrong Anderson. "Trinity," Arthur said, his voice shaking slightly. "Why? Why did you let it get this far? Why didn't you leak this sooner?" "Because you wouldn't have listened," I said simply. "You would have circled the wagons. You would have called me a hysterical daughter trying to get attention. You needed to see the signature on the contract. You needed to see the insolvency filing. You needed the crash to realize that the pilot was asleep at the wheel." I walked back to my chair and sat down. "I am not here to destroy the company," I said. "I am here to save what is left of it. But to do that, you need to excise the rot." Eleanor Vance closed her laptop. She looked down the table at the 12 terrified men and women. "The evidence is conclusive," she said. "Robert Anderson acted with gross negligence and willful misconduct. Lucas Anderson engaged in criminal market manipulation under the bylaws of the corporation, and in compliance with the emergency powers granted by the insolvency event. You have grounds for immediate removal." Arthur Sterling looked at the other board members. They exchanged quick, desperate glances. They were survivors. They knew that if they didn't act now, the SEC would come for them next for lack of oversight. "I move to strip Robert Anderson of his title as CEO and chairman of the board, effective immediately," Arthur said. His voice was quiet but firm. "Seconded," said a woman across the table. "And Lucas Anderson," Arthur added. "Terminate his employment for cause and cooperate fully with the federal investigation into his trades." "Agreed," the table murmured in unison. It took 30 seconds to end a 50-year reign. The vote was unanimous. Arthur turned to me. "Trinity, we need an interim statement. We need someone the market won't eat alive. The Zurich Consortium is seizing control, but they need a face, someone who saw this coming." "I am not an executive," I said. "I am just the girl who was grounded." "You are the only person in this building with clean hands," Eleanor Vance said. "And you are the only one who holds the data map of the fraud. If you walk away, the investigators will spend 5 years tearing this place apart. If you stay, you can guide them. You can minimize the damage." I looked at the empty chair at the head of the table. My father's chair. "I won't take the title," I said. "I don't want his job, but I will act as a special consultant to the liquidation committee. I will help you unwind the Logic Systems deal. I will help you recover the assets Lucas tried to hide, but I have conditions." "Name them," Arthur said. "First, the employee pension fund is made whole before any executive bonuses are paid," I said. "Second, we issue a public apology, not a mistakes were made statement, a full admission of the failure of governance. And third—" I paused. "I want to be the one to tell him," I said. Arthur nodded slowly. "He is in the holding room. Security has his badge." I stood up. The meeting was adjourned. The lawyers were already typing up the motions. The board members were pulling out their phones to call their brokers. I walked out of the boardroom. The air in the hallway felt different now. The crushing weight of my father's presence was gone. The building felt like a machine that had broken down. And for the first time, I held the wrench. I walked toward the executive holding room. 2 guards stood outside. They saw me coming. They didn't ask for ID. They stepped aside and opened the door. My father was sitting at a small conference table, staring at a blank wall. He looked up when I entered. He saw the expression on my face. He saw the lack of fear. He saw the end. "It is done," I said. He didn't ask what I meant. He knew. The board had turned. The power had shifted, and the daughter he had tried to silence was now the only voice left speaking. The crisis management team had set up a war room in the main conference center on the 45th floor. It was Sunday afternoon, 48 hours after the signing ceremony that never finished. The room smelled of stale coffee and printer toner. Lawyers were shouting into headsets. Shredders were humming in the background, supervised by federal agents, and the whiteboards were covered in timelines of disaster. I was sitting in the corner, reviewing the asset forfeiture list, when Eleanor Vance walked over. She was carrying a box. It was not a sleek, digital drive like the one I had dropped in the garbage disposal. It was an old, cardboard banker's box, the corners crushed, the label yellowed with age. "We found this in a safe in your father's private bathroom," Eleanor said, placing the box on the table with a heavy thud. "He didn't keep it in the office. He didn't keep it in the cloud. He kept it next to his shaving kit." "What is it?" I asked. "It is the origin story," she said, her voice devoid of emotion. "The team thinks it is irrelevant to the current bankruptcy. It falls outside the statute of limitations, but given your role as consultant, I thought you should see it. It explains a lot about the corporate culture." She walked away, leaving me alone with the ghosts. I opened the lid. Inside were binders from 30 years ago. The paper was brittle. The typeface was from an electric typewriter. I began to read, and as I turned the pages, the final pillar of my father's mythology crumbled into dust. The story Robert Anderson told the world was a classic American fairy tale. He claimed he started Anderson Global with a small loan and a brilliant idea for container logistics. He claimed he built the empire brick by brick through hard work and innovation. The documents in the box told a different story, a story of blood. The company wasn't founded. It was stolen. In 1985, my father was not an innovator. He was a junior partner in a firm called Mercer Logistics, run by a man named Elias Mercer. The records showed that Mercer was the genius. Mercer had developed the routing algorithms that became the backbone of modern shipping. My father was just the account manager. But Mercer had a weakness. He trusted his partner. I read the memos. I read the legal filings that had been sealed by a court settlement 3 decades ago. My father had quietly leveraged Mercer's assets without his knowledge. He had forged Mercer's signature on high-risk loans, deliberately driving the company into a liquidity trap. When the debts came due, Mercer couldn't pay. Then came the kill shot. Robert Anderson, using a shell company funded by unknown backers, stepped in as the savior. He offered to buy the assets of Mercer Logistics out of bankruptcy for pennies on the dollar. He bought the patents, the trucks, the warehouses, and the client list. He bought the life's work of Elias Mercer for a fraction of its value, renamed it Anderson Global, and erased Mercer's name from history. Elias Mercer didn't just lose his company. The legal fees bankrupt him personally. A clipping from a local newspaper, tucked into the back of the binder, served as the epitaph. Local businessman found dead in garage. Ruled suicide. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. This was why my father was so terrified of the Logic Systems deal failing. This was why he panicked when I showed him the fraud. He wasn't just afraid of losing money. He was afraid of the mirror. He was seeing his own sin reflected back at him. The Logic Systems deal was a carbon copy of what he had done to Mercer. The target company had inflated its value, hidden its debts, and tried to trap a buyer. My father had spent his life fearing that someone would do to him what he had done to Elias Mercer. He lived in terror of the karma that had finally arrived. He wasn't a titan of industry. He was a pirate who had finally been boarded by a bigger ship. Trinity. I looked up. A federal agent was standing there. "Your brother is asking to see you. He is in the interview room down the hall. We are about to transfer him to the detention center." I closed the box. I will be right there. The interview room was stark. Lucas was sitting at a metal table, his hands cuffed in front of him. He looked like he hadn't slept in 3 days. His expensive suit was wrinkled, and he had chewed his fingernails down to the quick. When I walked in, he lunged forward, the chain of his cuffs rattling against the table. "You set me up," he screamed. "Tell them, Trinity! Tell them you hacked my accounts. Tell them you planted the trade logs." I stood by the door, keeping my distance. "I didn't plant anything, Lucas. I just turned on the lights." "You did this," he spat, his eyes wide and bloodshot. "You were always jealous. You wanted the chair. You wanted the power. You destroyed the family just to prove you were smart." "I didn't destroy the family," I said quietly. "Dad destroyed it 30 years ago when he built this house on a grave, and you destroyed it when you bet against your own blood for a payout." "They have nothing," Lucas shouted, looking frantically at the two-way mirror. "It is circumstantial. I will fight it. I have the best lawyers in the city." "You have a public defender, Lucas," I informed him. "The estate has been frozen. The Zurich Consortium has filed an injunction against all family assets to cover the bridge loan default. You can't afford the best lawyers anymore. You can't even afford bail." He froze. The reality of his position finally breached his delusion. He wasn't a billionaire in temporary trouble. He was a broke criminal defendant facing a federal indictment. "Trinity," he whined, his voice dropping to a pathetic beg. "Please, you have the Knox data. You can edit it. You can make it look like a glitch, like an auto-trade algorithm gone wrong. Please, I am your brother." "You are the man who told Dad to call security on me," I said. "You are the man who laughed when they locked me in the penthouse. You are the man who tried to profit from the ruin of 40,000 employees." I reached into my pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. It was a printout of the final evidence file I had handed to the DOJ an hour ago. "This is the last nail. Lucas," I said, sliding it across the table. "It is the chat log from your Bloomberg terminal. The one where you bragged to your broker that the old man is going to crash the plane, and I have the only parachute. It proves intent. It proves premeditation. There is no glitch defense. There is no way out." Lucas stared at the paper. He slumped back in his chair, defeated. He began to weep, ugly, sobbing tears of a man who had never faced a consequence in his life. I turned and walked out. I didn't feel triumph. I just felt clean. In the lobby, the television screens were broadcasting the evening news. The narrative had shifted completely. The tragedy of Anderson Global was gone. The headline now read, "House of Lies, Inside the Anderson Fraud." They were showing pictures of the Mercer family now. Reporters had dug up the old history. Guided by an anonymous tip I had sent earlier that morning, they were connecting the dots. The world was seeing Robert Anderson not as a fallen hero, but as a predator who had finally been caught. The glossy veneer of the billionaire lifestyle was peeled away, revealing the rot underneath. The stock was effectively zero. The brand was toxic. The name Anderson, once a golden ticket, was now a mark of shame. I walked out of the building and onto the plaza. The press was still there. A swarm of cameras and microphones held back by barricades. They saw me and started shouting my name. "Trinity! Trinity! Did you know about Mercer? Did you testify against your father? What happens to the money?" I ignored them. I walked to the curb where a simple town car waited. It wasn't a company limo. It was a hired service. I got in. "Where to, Miss Anderson?" the driver asked. I looked back at the glass tower. It rose into the night sky, dark and imposing. It was a monument to ego, built on theft and maintained by deceit. And now, it was empty. "Take me to the Federal Reserve Bank," I said. "I have one more meeting." I had exposed the past. I had neutralized the present. But there was one final thing to do. The empire was dead, but the carcass was still there, and the vultures were circling. The Zurich Consortium wanted to strip it for parts. They wanted to liquidate the pension fund to pay themselves back. I wasn't going to let that happen. I pulled out my phone, a new one, bought with my own money. I opened the NOx interface. Protocol, Lazarus, I typed. It was the final command, the one I had saved for the end. Robert Anderson had stolen the company from Mercer. He had tried to steal the future from his employees. He thought he owned everything. But he forgot that in the digital age, ownership is just a matter of access keys. And thanks to his negligence and Lucas's stupidity, I had them all. I was going to the meeting with the creditors not to negotiate a surrender, but to dictate terms. I was going to use the last hidden assets, the ones Knox had found buried in the deepest offshore accounts that even the feds hadn't found yet, to buy the company back. Not for my father, not for Lucas, for the people who actually built it. The car pulled away into traffic. The story of the billionaire's daughter was over. The story of the new CEO was just beginning. The meeting room at the Federal Reserve Bank of New York was a fortress of limestone and iron, a place where dreams went to be audited and empires went to die. It was 10 o'clock on Monday morning. The air inside was recycled and cold, smelling faintly of old paper and the terrifying sterility of absolute power. This was not a board meeting. This was a liquidation hearing. At the center of the massive oak table sat the Emergency Creditor Committee, led by the Zurich Consortium and flanked by federal regulators. On the left side sat the remnants of the Anderson Global Board, looking like passengers on a sinking ship. And on the right side, sitting alone, was my father. Robert Anderson looked like a man who was trying to hold up the sky with his bare hands. He was wearing his best suit, a charcoal three-piece that cost more than most people earned in a year, but it hung loosely on his frame. His face was pale, his eyes sunken, but his jaw was set in that familiar, stubborn line. He still believed he was the CEO. He still believed that his sheer force of will could reverse the flow of the river. I walked into the room. The heavy doors clicked shut behind me, a sound that echoed like a gavel. Every head turned. The regulators looked curious. The board members looked relieved. My father looked furious. "You have no business being here," Robert said, his voice raspy but loud. "This is a closed session for executive leadership and primary creditors. You hold no title. Trinity." I walked past him. I didn't look at him. I walked straight to the head of the table, where the Zurich representative, a man named Herr Muller, was sitting. "I am here as a verified whistleblower," I said, my voice calm and projecting to the corners of the room. "And I am here as the holder of the Lazarus Protocol." "The what?" Robert scoffed. "More of your computer games?" "Herr Muller, I demand you remove her. She is a disgruntled child who has been working to sabotage my reputation." Herr Muller did not look at my father. He looked at me. "We received your data packet at 6 o'clock this morning. Miss Anderson, please, sit down." I took the seat directly opposite my father. For the first time, we were equals. "We are here to decide the fate of Anderson Global Holdings," Muller announced. "Mr. Anderson has proposed a restructuring plan that involves a massive injection of high-interest debt to pay off the immediate liabilities. He claims this will save the company." "It will," Robert insisted, leaning forward. "We just need time. The market panicked. It was an overreaction. Logic Systems had some accounting irregularities, yes, but the core assets are sound. If you give me 6 months, I can turn this around. I built this company. I am the only one who can fix it." "You didn't build it," I said. The room went deadly silent. "You stole it," I continued, looking him dead in the eyes. "From Elias Mercer, 30 years ago." Robert flinched as if I had struck him. "That is ancient history. That has nothing to do with this." "It has everything to do with this," I said, "because it proves a pattern. It proves that the culture of this company, from the foundation to the penthouse, is built on fraud. And you are doing it again. You are asking these creditors for more money to cover up a lie." I opened the folder in front of me. "The restructuring plan my father proposed relies on the valuation of our proprietary software," I said to the committee. "But I ran a diagnostic last night. The software doesn't exist. The code was leased from a shell company owned by Lucas Anderson. If you lend him this money, it will flow directly into that shell company and vanish. Robert slammed his fist on the table. That is a lie. Lucas made a mistake, but the assets are real. Lucas is in federal custody, I reminded him, and the assets are smoke. I slid a document across the table to Mueller. This is the proof, I said. It is the source code repository. It is empty. The $19 billion valuation was based on a hollow box. Mueller looked at the document. He passed it to the regulator on his left. The regulator nodded grimly. Mr. Anderson, Mueller said, his voice icy. Is this true? She is manipulating the data, Robert shouted, standing up. She is trying to steal the company from me. Trinity, stop this. I am your father. I gave you everything. Do you want to see us on the street? Do you want to destroy the family name? The name is already destroyed, I said, remaining seated. I am trying to save the people who work for it. I turned back to Mueller. I have a counterproposal, I said. The Lazarus Protocol. We are listening, Mueller said. We liquidate the executive holdings, I stated. We seize the personal assets of Robert Anderson and Lucas Anderson. As per the fraud clauses in the corporate bylaws, we use that capital, combined with the pension fund surplus, to buy out the insolvent debts of the Logic Systems acquisition. We spin off the logistics division as an independent entity, owned by the employees and managed by a transparent trust. And the leadership? Mueller asked. Robert Anderson is removed, permanently, I said. The board is dissolved and reconstituted with independent oversight. And who runs it? Robert sneered. You? Is that what this is about? You want the crown? No, I said. I don't want the crown. I don't want the office. I don't want the title. I will serve as a technical advisor during the transition, for a salary of $1. Once the transition is complete, I walk away. I looked at the board members. This is the only way to avoid a total collapse, I said. If you back my father's plan, the SEC will shut you down by Friday. If you back my plan, the company survives, the employees keep their jobs, and the creditors get 70 cents on the dollar instead of 0. Mueller looked at the other creditors. They exchanged nods. It wasn't even a debate. It was simple math. The committee accepts the proposal, Mueller said. He turned to my father. Robert Anderson, Mueller said formally, by the power vested in this committee and the emergency bylaws triggered by the insolvency event, you are hereby removed as CEO and chairman of Anderson Global Holdings. Your security clearance is revoked. Your access to company accounts is terminated immediately. Robert stood there, frozen. He looked around the room, waiting for someone to object, waiting for the loyalty he thought he had bought. But the board members looked down at their hands. The regulators looked at their screens. He was alone. No, Robert whispered. You can't do this. I own 40% of the voting stock. Your stock was pledged as collateral, I said softly, and since the value dropped to 0 this morning, that collateral now belongs to the bank. You don't own 40%. Dad, you don't own anything. He looked at me. The anger drained out of him, leaving only a terrible, hollow shock. He realized, finally, that the game was over. He realized that the girl he had grounded, the daughter he had dismissed as a decoration, had outmaneuvered him on every single front. Why? He asked, his voice cracking. Why would you do this to your own blood? Because you taught me to look at the data, I said. And the data said you were a liability. I stood up. Security, Mueller said. Please escort Mr. Anderson from the building. 2 federal agents stepped forward. They didn't touch him, but they stood close enough to make it clear that he had no choice. Robert Anderson, the billionaire, the titan, the man who had terrified Wall Street for 40 years, walked toward the door. He walked with a shuffle, his head down, a man crushed by the weight of his own hubris. He stopped at the door and looked back at me one last time. There was no hate in his eyes anymore, just a profound confusion. He still didn't understand how he had lost. Then he was gone. The room let out a collective breath. The tension broke. "Miss Anderson," Mueller said, standing up and extending his hand. "Thank you. You just saved 40,000 jobs." I shook his hand. "Do not thank me. Just make sure the check's clear." I picked up my folder. I walked out of the conference room and down the long marble hallway of the Federal Reserve. I stepped out into the bright sunlight of Lower Manhattan. The air smelled of salt and exhaust, but to me, it smelled like freedom. My phone buzzed. It was a notification from the building security system at the penthouse. My access had been restored. The locks were open. The guards were gone. I didn't need to go back there. I didn't need the penthouse. I didn't need the billions. I had spent 30 years trying to be the perfect daughter, trying to earn a place in a world that was rigged against me. I had been grounded, silenced, and dismissed. But in the silence of that room, I had found my voice. I hailed a taxi. "Where to?" the driver asked. "Anywhere," I said, leaning back and watching the skyline recede. "Just drive." My father had grounded me at 30 for $19 billion. He thought he could bury me. He forgot that I was a seed. And now, the empire was gone, and I was the only one left standing in the garden. The check was paid, the debt was settled, and the story was finally mine. Thank you so much for listening to this story. I would love to know where you are tuning in from. So please drop a comment below and let me know your country or city, and tell me what you thought about Trinity's Revenge. If you enjoyed this series, please make sure to subscribe to the Lila Revenge Stories channel, like this video, and hit that hype button so more people can hear this story. See you in the next one.